Jonathan has given me no choice except to speak out. Everyone knows.
The once untouchable Christian media personality Joni Lamb has suddenly lost everything. Fans and insiders were left in complete shock when her empire abruptly collapsed. For many years, Joni represented authority, strength, and faith. Now, all she created has collapsed in a matter of minutes. What took place behind closed doors? Finally, the truth is emerging, and it's more explosive than anyone could have predicted. This is just the beginning, so stay tuned. Once based on unity, love, and faith, Joni Lamb's empire is now disintegrating in front of her. She was Daystar's dependable spokesperson for many years, inspiring millions with her poise and fortitude. People trusted her, attended her performances, and had faith in. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing content. And hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Now, back to the topic. What we were talking about was the messages she provided. Now, however, things are different. She no longer has the same warmth in her voice. She no longer exudes the confidence she once had, and her grin seems smaller. It's difficult to ignore the fact that something is awry. Joni was all over the place only a few months ago. She was hosting her shows, operating Daystar, enjoying the high life, and soaring private aircraft, and giving appearances that cemented her reputation in the Christian media. She had the upper hand. Regarded as a ray of hope and greatly admired. All of that, though, seems like a faraway memory now. A change has occurred. There is a problem. We remain steadfast in our faith because we know that God is with us and that His plan for Daystar is much bigger than any difficulties we may be facing right now. Although I am aware that our fight is not against flesh and blood, the onslaught is extremely painful and terrible. The turning point was Jonis' marriage to Dayar. Dog Weiss, which took place only 2 years after Marcus Lamb's passing. Her fans weren't the only ones who were surprised. Those who had followed her for years were taken aback. Anger and confusion were sparked by her new relationship. People were perplexed by her ability to move on, so Marcus, the face of Daystar and the man who started the network from the beginning, passed away shortly after she did. Many thought Joni would honor Marcus' memory by grieving for a longer period of time. Rather, she proceeded with Doug. Rumors of betrayal and a feeling of alienation accompanied that choice. Joni's hasty remarriage was not solely her decision. For Daystar, the repercussions were severe. Jonathan, her son, who had always supported her, was aloof all of a sudden. He had collaborated with Marcus, sharing the Daystar vision, and now it seemed as though his position was being taken over. Now occupying the table and stealing the show was Doug Weiss, who had no prior association with the Lamb family. As time passed, it became evident that Doug was more than just Joni's husband. His presence was indisputable. In the eyes of Daystar, he was rising to prominence. Supporters started to wonder if this was about control or love. Was Doug attempting to usurp Marcus' legacy? Joni's former crowd started to fade away as Daystar's attention turned to Doug and his goal. A chilly, businesslike attitude replaced the familiar warmth that had formerly defined Daystar. Once devoted viewers, donors, and even pastors who had been supporting the network for years began to turn away. The stillness in the ministry became louder, and the comments under Joni's posts became more sinister. The link between people had diminished. Daystar was not feeling like herself. Joni tried to cover the fissures by maintaining a smile throughout it all. The changes at Daystar and the choice to wed Doug had already had a negative impact. Her dominion was disintegrating gradually as her followers' affection and trust started to wane. Supporters were left wondering what had transpired, where the woman they had previously trusted had disappeared to, and if Daystar would ever be able to return to its former ministry. At first, the familial division that has rocked Joni Lamb and Daystar was barely noticeable. However, it wasn't long until it was hard to ignore. One choice seems to be the catalyst for the divisions inside the Lamb family. Straightforward decision that became the tipping moment. Just 2 years after her husband Marcus Lamb passed away, Joni married Dr. Doug Weiss. For a lot of people, this was the start of a chain of events that broke the family apart. Together, Joni and Marcus had constructed Daystar. There was more to it than a network. Their legacy was that they served as Daystar spokesperson for many years, representing togetherness, family, and faith. They collaborated on projects, preached together, and had a similar ministry goal. Daystar's development was fueled by Marcus. However, Joni was by his side, a resolute and encouraging presence that made their goal a reality. They created something remarkable together. A platform that changed lives, reached millions, and inspired hope. However, everything changed when Marcus abruptly died. Given that Joni had lost her long-term companion, grief was to be expected. The ministry team, her family, and even her fans anticipated that Joni would take some time to mourn and think back on her life with Marcus and the legacy they had created. However, what transpired was not at all what everyone had anticipated. Rather than lingering in grief, Joni hurried forward. Only 2 years. Joni remarried following Marcus's passing. Not just anybody, anyway. She wed Doug Weiss, a man who had never been associated with Daystar or the Lamb family. This was the pivotal moment for many. In addition to shocking her admirers, Joni's choice to be married so soon after Marcus' death also stunned her family. Jonathan, her son, who had spent years working with Marcus and had shared his vision for Daystar, was distraught. It seemed to Jonathan that his father was being replaced, not just in Joni's affections, but also in the ministry that Marcus had established. Weiss was more than just Joni's new spouse, ugh. He was emerging as Daystar's new leader. One that appeared to eclipse Marcus' legacy. And the division started there. Jonathan and his father had always been close. He admired Marcus, worked beside him, and looked up to him. They had a close relationship, and Jonathan was thought to be Marcus's logical successor. He has hosted, preached, and assisted in the management of Daystar during his years in the ministry. But all of a sudden, things were shifting. Now, Doug Weiss, who had just come into the picture, was playing a bigger part in the ministry. He was spotted with Joni. On air, giving counsel, preaching, and even assuming Marcus's former position. Jonathan found it hard to watch this. It was more than just the speed at which his mother had moved on. The reason for this was that her new husband was now being positioned at the forefront of Daystar, which Marcus had devoted his life to creating. Jonathan felt marginalized. He was no longer Daystar's face. Rather, Doug was the one being presented as Joni's new cover. The word covering has important connotations in Christian communities. It's a leadership and authority role that is also spiritual. Additionally, many people believe that calling Doug Joni covering was a betrayal of Marcus' legacy. Jonathan initially remained silent. He stopped going to the broadcasts, stayed away, and started to distance themselves from the limelight. Fans started to notice that he was silent. They began to inquire. Why didn't Jonathan raise his voice? Why didn't he back his mother's union? Why did he not celebrate her new relationship as they had anticipated? The anxiety increased behind the scenes. Joni's choice to be married. The family had been divided by Doug Weiss. Jonathan, who had always been so devoted, now had to choose between embracing his mother's new life and preserving his father's legacy. As Doug started to exert greater authority, things got worse. He was more than just Joni's spouse. Now he was behaving as though he had a say in all that Daystar did. He began making choices, proposing fresh concepts, and advocating for additional programs, more therapy-related material, and a different course for the network. Marcus didn't envision Daystar like this. The original goal of the ministry didn't seem to be in line with Doug's beliefs. Furthermore, Jonathan, who had spent so much time in the ministry, couldn't just watch it happen. However, it seemed as though Joni was stifling his voice whenever he attempted to speak. Love for Doug blinded Joni, who began to stand up for him even when others. She was being warned by many around her that things were becoming out of control. She felt that Doug was sent by God and that Daystar was beginning a new chapter in her life. In her opinion, Doug was the best person to help her navigate the fallout from Marcus' passing and the future of the ministry. However, Jonathan felt as though he was losing everything. He felt neglected, replaced, and left behind. As the years passed, the gap widened. Jonathan stopped attending important functions. His mother's broadcasts were not attended by him. He had vanished from Daystar's view. His absence was noticed by others, and the rumors were only strengthened by the stillness. How come Jonathan wasn't present? Was he upset? Was he injured? Joni attempted to dismiss it, pretending that nothing was wrong. However, the family was disintegrating behind closed doors. Unity, family conversations, and times of prayer were no longer present. Rather, a silent conflict was developing. A conflict between a son attempting to preserve the legacy his father had established and a mother standing up for her new husband. A few Daystar employees also became aware of the change. There were rumors that the network was losing its roots, that Jonathan was being forced out, and that Doug's influence was becoming more powerful. The network that had previously felt like a family ministry now felt more like a business, and the family was no longer united. Joni was at the heart of it all. She is torn between loving her new husband and remaining faithful to her late husband's inheritance. The gap wasn't only between Jonathan and Joni. The entire ministry was affected. Pastors, supporters, and contributors started to turn away. Longtime viewers stopped tuning in. Some even subtly withdrew their support because they didn't want to keep funding a ministry that didn't seem sincere. Once a ray of hope and solidarity, Daystar was now a site of confusion and discord. Joni also didn't appear to be able or want to slow down in the middle of everything. She continued to upload joyful photos of herself with Doug, smile, and portray a picture of tranquility. The family split started with a single choice, despite the fact that the foundation beneath her was collapsing. The choice to wed Doug Weiss was now completely shattered. Joni's son died. Her family's loss of harmony. And Daystar lost its identity, leaving the viewers who had been its ardent supporters bewildered and devastated. What has become of the family they had once trusted? What became of the woman who had motivated them with her leadership and faith? The quiet got louder every day, and there were no explanations to be discovered. The harm had been done, and the rift was too deep to repair. Finished. At first, the change in Daystar was gradual, like a slight alteration in the breeze that nobody noticed until it was too late. For many years, Daystar served as a ray of hope, a place where viewers might find fellowship, inspiration, and faith. The network was created from the ground up by Joni Lamb and her late husband Marcus. It was more than just a TV station. It was a ministry where family and faith served as the cornerstones. However, things gradually began to feel different. Something colder and more calculating seemed to take the place of the principles upon which Daystar was founded. Less than 2 years after Marcus' unexpected death, Joni remarried Dr. Doug Weiss, which was the beginning of it all. This marked the start of the change for many. Many people were surprised by Joni's new relationship. Her longtime acquaintances were perplexed. Some even suffered injuries. Marcus had served as Daystar's spokesperson and the ministry's lifeblood. He had dedicated his entire life to creating the network. It seems that his legacy was now being disregarded. The choice of Joni to wed Doug. Some believed that it was a betrayal to act so soon after Marcus' passing. It was about what happened after the marriage, not just the marriage itself. Something changed when Joni married Doug. On Daystar, Doug was more than a visitor. He was more than just Joni's ally. He rose to prominence in the network very rapidly. He began to sit next to her on her shows and even preach next to her. Doug's introduction as Joni Covering didn't take long. The word covering has a particular connotation for Christians. It suggests protection, direction, and spiritual power. Many people believed that by designating Doug as her covering, Marcus was being replaced in both her heart and Daystar's leadership. Viewers were silent at first. They observed Joni content. and they believed that to be the most important factor. However, the fissures began to show over time. Joni's son Jonathan grew notably aloof. He had been a regular at Daystar, working with his father and hosting performances. But Jonathan quieted down when Doug arrived. He stopped going to important events and was less frequently visible on television. Questions started to surface as fans started to notice. Jonathan was where? He should have been celebrating his mother's recent marriage, but he wasn't. Why was there a sense that something was lacking? It was considerably worse behind the scenes. The once close-knit Lamb family was now split. After years of working with Marcus, Jonathan felt that his father's legacy was being lost. In Daystar, Doug Weiss was gaining prominence, making choices, offering counsel and even delivering sermons. Conversely, Jonathan was being forced out. He was unsure of how to respond to what he perceived as a reduction in his function in the ministry. Joni didn't seem to be listening when he tried to communicate. She trusted Doug and was in love with him. Doug, in her opinion, was God's messenger and the one who might assist lead Daystar into the future. Jonathan, on the other hand, felt as though everything his father had created was being taken away. The alterations grew more noticeable as the months passed. Doug began to exert more influence over Daystar's course. He was no longer only Joni's spouse. He was assuming the role of the ministry's new leader. He had great ambitions of his own that weren't always in line with Marcus's vision for Daystar. He advocated for more information about counseling, more attention to his own brand, and less focus on Daystar's distinctive features. When Marcus created the network, this was not his intention. Doug's concept seemed different. It was less about faith and service and more about branding and growth. A number of Daystar employees began to feel uneasy. Employees who had been with the Lamb family for years started to depart. Others were forced out, while others quietly resigned. Employee dissatisfaction with being instructed to shift their focus away from the fundamental principles that had founded Daystar was rumored. The ministry, which had previously been a family-run business, was now being managed like a corporation, and many people didn't like the way it was going. Jonathan was also burdened by the change. He no longer went to the broadcasts. He ceased sharing content on social media. He no longer took part in the activities that had constituted his existence. Those who had come to love Jonathan as a member of the Daystar family began to question why he was no longer present. They were unsure of how to react when they witnessed Doug stealing the show. It was. Seeing Joni move on after Marcus's passing was one thing, but witnessing her new spouse rise to such prominence in the ministry was quite another. The supporters were not blind to Daystar's changes. Donations started to decline. The number of viewers began to decline. People were perplexed and didn't know where the ministry was going. Daystar used to be a location where viewers could tune in and experience a sense of harmony and tranquility, almost like a family. It felt more like a business now, though. Something colder and more remote seems to have taken the place of the warmth that had once emanated from the Lamb family. Joni kept sharing happy, smiling photos of herself and Doug on social media. However, there were no longer any compliments in the comments section of her posts. Her decisions were now being questioned by her former supporters. They were interested in learning why she had moved on so fast, why she wasn't paying tribute to Marcus' legacy the way they had hoped after she married Doug. However, Joni remained silent. She continued to smile, upload images of her life, and act as though nothing was wrong. In actuality, things weren't going well. Daystar was undergoing a negative transformation. The network, which had previously seemed to be a ray of hope and family, was now having trouble finding its footing. The previously cohesive Lamb family was disintegrating. Joni was too preoccupied with her recent marriage to notice what was going on, while Jonathan was retreating. The ministry that had meant so much to so many people, Daystar, had changed. There was nothing anyone could do to prevent the shift from occurring. And in all of this, the audience was left with inquiries. They sought clarification. They were curious about the fate of the family they had put their trust in. They were curious as to why the ministry they had long backed was failing. However, Joni was not answering their questions. She was too preoccupied with Doug and Daystar's new course. Marcus Lamb's empire was collapsing, and it appeared that nobody was ready to put a stop to it. At first, many people were unaware of the gradual, silent decline of Daystar. The network had stood for togetherness, family, and faith for many years. Daystar had been meticulously constructed from the ground up by Joni Lamb and her late husband Marcus. It was more than a television network. It was a place of ministry where individuals could connect with their faith, find hope, and feel like they were a part of something bigger. A family that is encouraging. However, something changed in the last several years. Once emanating from the Lamb family, the warmth began to wane. It took time for it to happen. It wasn't a sudden scandal or a precipitous decline in popularity. That was not at all how calm it was. Everything that had once been so solid and cohesive was slowly coming apart. Joni's second marriage appeared to be the pivotal moment. Many were taken aback by the decision, particularly considering the date. Marcus, her cherished husband, had died not long before. Together, they had created Daystar, and his passing affected not just Joni but also the millions of viewers who had grown to depend on his constant presence. However, Joni abrupt changed to Dr. Doug Weiss as her new partner left. Folks who were curious about what had transpired. There were others who questioned if Joni had really dealt with the loss of Marcus. The speed with which she moved on made others uneasy. They thought it was too abrupt and too early. However, Joni was content. Doug was a gift from God, and their connection was a part of his divine design, she made apparent to the world. She wrote about it on social media, expressing her happiness to her fans. However, something started to change behind the scenes. Daystar began to feel different, even if it had always been about the Lamb family. Doug was more than just a recent arrival in Joni's life. He rose to prominence in the network very rapidly. It appeared harmless enough at first. Doug made appearances on Joni programs, advising her, telling her stories, and sometimes preaching with her. However, it didn't end there. Doug began to assume increasing responsibility. He was no longer merely a visitor. They were introducing him as Joni Cover. The word covering had deep importance for anyone familiar with the religion community. It was frequently used to characterize a leader or spouse who offered spiritual support and direction. However, for many, it was strange, almost incorrect, to hear Doug called Joni Covering. It seemed as though this new man had destroyed Marcus' legacy. A few employees and fans started to feel apprehensive. Was Doug attempting to replace Marcus? Was Joni willing to give up everything her husband had created because she was so engrossed in her new relationship? Joni's son Jonathan Lamb was among the first to withdraw. He has been a regular at Daystar, working with Marcus and hosting shows. The two had a close relationship in ministry and life, and Jonathan had admired his father as a mentor. However, Jonathan began to withdraw once Joni wed Doug. He was less frequently seen on television. He no longer went to important events. He made less posts. And less on social media. The alteration was noticed by fans. They questioned Jonathan's whereabouts, his lack of vocalization, and his failure to celebrate his mother's recent marriage. It was terrible behind the scenes. Jonathan was upset about what was going on, according to family sources. He thought Daystar was altering too rapidly, similar to his father's legacy was disappearing.